A group of teenagers had decided to explore the creepy basement of an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. They had heard rumors that the basement was haunted, and they were eager to see if they could encounter any ghosts. As they made their way down the creaky stairs, they could feel the air getting colder and the atmosphere becoming more oppressive. They reached the bottom of the stairs and turned on their flashlights, scanning the dark corners of the room for any signs of paranormal activity. Suddenly, they heard a strange noise coming from the other side of the room. It sounded like a low moan, and it seemed to be getting closer. The teenagers froze in terror, their hearts racing with fear. And then they saw him, an old man, dressed in tattered clothes, with a long white beard and deep wrinkles on his face. He appeared out of nowhere, standing in the middle of the room, staring at them with empty eyes. The teenagers were petrified, and they tried to run, but the old man seemed to be blocking their path. They were trapped in the basement with a ghostly presence, and they didn't know how to escape. As they stood there, frozen in terror, the old man slowly raised his arms and began to speak. His voice was shaky and barely audible, but the teenagers could hear him whispering something incoherent. They couldn't make out what he was saying, but they could feel the sadness and desperation in his words. It was clear that this old man had been trapped in the basement for a long time, and he was desperately trying to communicate with the living. The teenagers tried to communicate with the old man, but he seemed to be too lost in his own world to pay attention to them. They decided to leave the basement, hoping that the old man would find some peace in the afterlife. As they ascended the stairs, they could feel the oppressive atmosphere of the basement lifting. It was as if the old man's spirit had been released, and he could finally rest in peace. The teenagers left the old, abandoned house, feeling a mixture of fear and sadness. They had encountered a ghostly presence that night, and it had left a profound impact on them. From that day on, they were more respectful of the supernatural world, knowing that there were forces beyond their control that could manifest themselves in unexpected ways. In the heart of a small town stood a house, with a spooky and unsettling basement that seemed to have a life of its own. The house was owned by an elderly woman, who had lived there alone for many years. She was known to be eccentric and reclusive, and locals whispered that the basement was haunted by the ghost of a young girl who had died in the house many years ago. One day, a young couple moved into the house, drawn to its history and beauty. They were both artists, and the spacious basement seemed like the perfect place to set up their studio. They spent their evenings down there, painting and creating, and for a while, everything seemed fine. But then, strange things began to happen. The couple would hear strange noises at all hours of the night, and objects would mysteriously move around the room. They would find their paint supplies scattered on the floor, and sometimes their artwork would be inexplicably ruined. One night, the couple was working on a project when they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the corner of the basement. They both jumped up, startled, and saw a dark, shadowy figure slowly emerging from the shadows. The figure was translucent, with long, flowing hair, and it glided across the floor towards them. The couple tried to run, but the basement door was locked, and they were trapped. The figure approached them, making strange noises, and then vanished into thin air. The couple was terrified, and they decided to leave the house the next day. But, as they were packing up their belongings, they heard another strange noise coming from the basement. They hesitated for a moment but then decided to investigate. As they descended the stairs, they saw the ghostly figure once again. But this time, it seemed to be beckoning them towards a hidden door in the wall. They cautiously followed the figure, their hearts pounding with fear. The door led to a hidden room, and as they entered, they saw a small, wooden chest sitting in the corner. The chest was old and worn, and it seemed to be beckoning them closer. They approached the chest and opened it, and inside, they found a diary. It belonged to the young girl who had died in the house many years ago. As they read through the diary, they learned that the girl had been forced to live in the basement by her abusive parents, and she had died there alone and afraid. The couple was overcome with emotion, and they decided to honor the girl's memory by leaving the basement as it was, and never disturbing her spirit again. From that day on, the basement was never used again, and locals say that the ghost of the young girl can still be heard whispering her story to those who are brave enough to listen. As soon as her parents left the house, Emily felt an uneasy sense of dread settle over her. She had always been afraid of being alone in the house, but tonight was different. The shadows seemed to be creeping closer, and the dark corners of the room seemed to hold secrets that she didn't want to know. As the night wore on, Emily found herself jumping at every little noise. The creak of the stairs sounded like footsteps, and the rustling of leaves outside the window sounded like someone trying to break in. She tried to distract herself by watching TV, but the images on the screen only made her more nervous. Every time she glanced away from the screen, she caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, as if something was lurking just out of sight. As the hours ticked by, Emily grew more and more uneasy. She decided to turn off the TV and go to bed, hoping that sleep would provide a respite from her fear. But as soon as she lay down in bed, she realized that the darkness was even worse. The shadows seemed to loom over her, and the silence was oppressive. She tried to calm herself by counting sheep, but every time she closed her eyes, she felt like something was watching her. As Emily lay in bed, she continued to hear the creepy sound from upstairs. After a while, she heard an eerie whispering in her ear. It was a faint voice, almost like a whisper, but she couldn't make out what it was saying. At the same time, she felt that somebody was touching her feet. She felt shivers run through her body, as she tried thinking what this may be. Suddenly, she felt the presence move closer, and the whispers grew louder. The touch on her leg became more aggressive, and she could feel the weight of something heavy on the bed next to her. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the presence was gone. Emily was left alone in the darkness, gasping for breath. As the morning sun rose, Emily got up and left the house, never looking back. She knew that she had experienced something truly terrifying, and she never wanted to go through it again. From that day forward, Emily would always be afraid of the dark, and she would always wonder what had really happened to her that night. But one thing was for sure, she knew that she was never truly alone, and that the darkness held many secrets that she would never be able to fully understand.